Well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Quinton Main. I am an associate professor here at the Kennedy School, and I'm delighted to introduce today's event, given the overlap between today's topic and my own research on public opinion and subnational politics in Europe. I just want to start with a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. First, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land in which Harvard sits as a traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. If you're interested in joining us for other events on issues of democracy, you can see our current schedule on the Ash Center website. We'll provide a link to sign up for email announcements in the chat. Today's event is being recorded and the video will be posted on the Ash Center YouTube channel. Everyone who signed up for this webinar will receive a link in the video, a link to the video in a follow-up email. You're welcome to submit questions anytime during the event. Please send them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via the chat. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's discussion, Pauliina Patana. Pauliina is currently a democracy postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Pauliina received her PhD in government from Cornell University in 2020. Her research focuses on political behavior, political economy, and party politics, primarily in Western democracies. Her book project, tentatively titled Residential Constraints and the Political Geography of the Populist Radical Right, examines the puzzling geographic patterns in the rise and popularity of populist radical right parties. With that, let me now hand the mic, so to speak, over to Pauliina.
Great. Thank you so much, Quinton, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today, and also a special thanks to James, Melissa, and Julianne for helping to make this event happen. So as Quinton mentioned, I have indeed spent a lot of time researching and thinking about today's topic myself, and I'm therefore really excited to have this conversation with a wonderful group of leading experts that we have with us today. So before we get started, let me just give a brief introduction of our panelists. So first of all, I'm really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Terri Givens, who's the CEO and founder of Brighter Higher Ed. So Terri is also a political scientist, and she has written extensively on the radical right and the impact of immigration and race on political systems in the US and Europe. And in addition to influential books on these topics like Voting Radical Right in Europe and Immigration in the 21st Century, she also has a new, very timely book called Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, that's coming out this Thursday from Policy Press, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I hope that we can touch on some of the themes of the book throughout the conversation as well. And I'm also very glad to have Professor Tariq Tachil with us. Tariq is the director of the Center for Advanced Study of India, and he's also the Madan Lal Sabti Chair for the Study of Contemporary India at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's written and published extensively on party politics, political behavior, and India's far-right BJP. And his first book, Elite Parties, Poor Voters, How Social Services Win Votes in India, won numerous awards, and he's currently writing a new book on how political networks form in urbanizing India that sounds really fascinating as well. And I'm also thrilled to have Professor Cristóbal Rovira from the University of Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile with us. Cristóbal, too, is one of the leading scholars on populism and right-wing parties, and he has done extensive research on the relationship between populism and democracy and on the contemporary populist forces and right-wing parties in Europe, Latin America, and the US. And Cristóbal has also co-authored and edited several key books on these topics, including the recent, also very timely, Populism, a very short introduction, co-authored with Cosmoody, which has already been translated into multiple languages. So again, welcome to you all, and I'm really excited for the conversation and have it especially from a comparative perspective. And I think for obvious reasons, a lot of the recent focus has been on the United States, and we've all surely seen countless electoral maps from the US over the past few months. I think even my 70-year-old uncle in rural Finland now knows how many votes were needed in specific counties and across Pennsylvania. Well, I think that the US is in many ways, of course, a special case when it comes to its electoral institutions. I think this all just really speaks to how important it is to pay attention to the geographic dynamics of political behavior and how populist radical right parties and politicians are affecting and shaping those dynamics. So let me first give the floor to Terri. So like in the United States, there are quite stark rural-urban divides in populist radical right support in many European countries as well. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us a little bit more about recent political developments in populist right-wing mobilization and support in Europe, and particularly what role do place and geography play in it in the European context? And is the story similar to the US?
Well, it's an interesting story because, for example, when I look at Germany, I see that, where has the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany, been successful? So, and I have to go back historically because I started studying this stuff in the 1990s. And back then, the geography wasn't so obvious. It was, there was some movement in terms of the radical right getting support in East Germany, but it didn't really, push out until later. And so one of the things I looked at back in the 90s was Bavaria and its kind of similarities to the American South. And, frankly, I lived in Texas for 12 years when I was at University of Texas at Austin. And, when I look at the state of Texas, I see similarities there between, to some Bavaria and the independents. They have their own separate version of the Christian Democrats, the CSU versus the CDU. That's where a lot of this kind of populist rhetoric has been pulled in terms of the Christian Democrats. So over time, we've seen the rhetoric of the far right becoming more mainstream and taken on by the parties like the CSU and the CDU to a certain extent. But the other dynamic is, of course, in Germany, the East German vote, and how I remember being in Dresden when you had the marches going on, and I'm going to forget the name of the movement, but so there's a lot of connection kind of to places where things, we talk a lot about the economic connections to the radical right. And of course, that's what I studied in my book, Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. But really, even back then, the stronger relationship was between kind of attitudes around immigration. But these were also what we call Männerpartei, parties of men. There's a 60-40 split. So there's the geography component of where people are, feeling, like in East Germany and so on, people are feeling, economically threatened, but there's also the cultural threat. And so I think in perhaps in Bavaria, the cultural threat may have played more of a role. And, we bring in the word race, which is a very complicated issue when you're talking about Europe. Because there's, a lot of issues around what is race, how are people racialized, is this a factor in the vote? And I think it's much more clear here in the US, research done by American political scientists, I think is more clear about the connection between race. And, I did see a connection between immigration and attitudes towards immigration, but there's a broader story to be told, and some of the geography there has to do with kind of the history and the connections. A lot of the vote for the National Front back in the 80s and 90s was coming from the south of France, where people who had been forced to leave Algeria and gave up their land and so on. And so they had this resentment towards Algerians, which was not necessarily racial, but just the fact that their families had been negatively impacted. And so, it's as always, when you're studying these things, it's a complicated story, but you can see some patterns in terms of, the vote for the Front National, and, even mayors being elected in the south of France, what's been going on in terms around issues around immigration in the south of Germany, and so on. But there's a lot of differences across countries in terms of how the radical right and populism has played out. And, I don't want to simplify it too much, but, I do think geography plays a role in different ways.
Thank you so much, Terri. And I think you touch on many important issues that we'll come back to in a little bit and talk more in detail about that. So now I want to give the floor to Tariq, who will be speaking to us about the Indian context. So we've seen the BJP and its leader Modi moving and increasingly solidifying its position of power in Indian politics in the past few years. So how has the BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party with historically elite upper caste base, managed to do this? And how do you see political geography mattering in the Indian context?
Yeah, thanks very much. So let me say that I'll talk a little bit more about the political geography of it, maybe in the next round of questions, because I know you have a more specific question on that. But I think at the outset, given that it's a comparative discussion, just a couple of clarifying notes are in order in terms of, as you mentioned, when we're talking about the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP in India, this is a party that's won 2 consecutive significant comprehensive national victories in 2014 and 2019. I know there are a lot of comparative audience members who may not know this history. And so that's significant in the Indian context. In 2014, that's the first time in 3 decades that a single party has won a parliamentary majority on its own. And then the BJP repeated this feat in 2019. So this is a significant electoral victory. And let me say that, given the kind of overall prompt, I'm going to focus my remarks on what are the drivers of electoral support for what we're calling in this panel right-wing populism. So let me begin by saying that, as we all may know, the term populism is a nebulous one. And in calling the BJP a populist party, we are essentially already hinting at an explanation. And we're saying that we're calling it a populist party because we're attributing a large degree of its success to the popularity of the leader, Narendra Modi. For example, the BJP actually headed a governing national coalition in 1999, and no one called that government a populist government. So in labeling this government populist, we're already making an inference that it's populist because a lot of its success is driven by Modi. So I want to just focus my remarks on what is driving this Modi effect. Because in the context of India, that's a parliamentary system. It's not always been the case that a single leader at the top drives election results. So when we're talking about it being populist, and even the term right wing is a little bit at odds with the way in which Indian politics is organized. Western categories of left and right don't fully map on to how Indian politics is organized. I'll talk a little bit later about the economic roots of the BJP's appeal, but I just want to say right now that it's a little bit awkward to use that category for the BJP, but to the degree that it has this incredibly popular leader, it is an accurate representation. So what is driving Narendra Modi's specific popularity and the kind of striking effect it's had on expanding the BJP's appeal beyond some of the confines of upper caste urban demographics where it's enjoyed its strongest support? So a couple of factors. One, Modi's personal popularity has been remarkably durable over the last several years. He's had a consistent lead over all other major national political leaders in India. Second, recent survey data shows that a recent Morning Consult poll that even in comparison to other world leaders, Macron, Merkel, Trudeau, Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi's ratings are consistently much higher. So his net favorability ratings really are strikingly large, even with respect to other so-called populist leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump. And the importance of this appeal became even sharper after the 2019 victory, in large part because, in fact, there seemed to be many structural headwinds going against the BJP in that victory. A lot of commentators were talking about the fact that there had been kind of lackluster economic growth, particularly on the jobs front in the Indian context during Modi's first term in office from 2014 to 2019. And yet, despite those economic headwinds, the BJP emerged even stronger in the 2019 result. And many concluded this was a direct function of Modi's personal appeal, unmediated personal appeal to voters that was stronger than the appeal of the BJP as a party, that trumped the kind of economic, perhaps stagnation that the Indian economy had been suffering. And so a lot of the debate in India has been, so what explains this kind of Teflon appeal that Modi has that directly and transcends that of partisan politics and connects directly to voters? And there's not enough time for me to go through all of these theories. I'm just going to highlight 5 very quick factors that are underlying Modi's direct appeal. Some rooted in his repeated references to his humble outsider origins, a kind of classic populist trope. He's presented himself as someone who sold tea at a train station as a child, who is not part of the dynastic networks that characterize elite politics in India, including of his major rivals in the Indian National Congress. The second dimension is that recent analysts have found that there is a sizable chunk of Indians who favor less economic intervention by the state and a reduced role for the state in regulating business and providing subsidies. And Modi's appeal is disproportionately concentrated amongst those voters. So there's an economic component to it. The third is he's been remarkably politically effective in delivering and claiming credit for an increasing array of benefits to voters that are provided directly from the center and cut through India's federal multi-tiered system. And that is a tremendous part of his direct appeal with voters. The fourth is that there's some survey evidence suggesting a rising proportion of Indians hold the view of the need of a strong leader to govern a corrupt and chaotic country, and Modi is especially effective in tapping that rising demand. And the fifth is that for portions of the BJP's most militant base, so not with every portion of its base, but its most militant base, Modi's appeal is thought to lie in his long-standing ideological commitment to Hindu nationalism, which predates his involvement in electoral politics, and the majoritarian rhetoric that's used by him and his closest associates in campaigns, his silence on violence against Muslims, and government policies that are seen as disproportionately punitive towards Muslims. And I'm happy to talk about what those are. But those are 5 major drivers of what is seen as his populist appeal. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Tariq. And let's next move on to Latin America, which is a region traditionally better known for its left-wing populism historically. And now in recent years, we have, however, seen, and I think Brazil's President Bolsonaro obviously is the predominant manifestation of this, an increasing receptiveness towards radical or right-wing populist politics and rhetoric, including in Chile. So Cristóbal, what do you think explains this shift, and how do you see geographic dynamics operating in that context?
Thanks, Pauliina, for the question and also for the interest in Latin America. And as you mentioned at the beginning in your question, Latin America is a huge continent. And because of that, it's quite difficult also to make like a broader general argument for the whole region. We're talking from Mexico till Chile, and also there are big economic differences within the region. But that being said, I would say that the populist radical right is the exception rather than the rule in the region. And in fact, there are 2 clear examples, I would say, that really fit the definition of the populist radical right in the Latin American context. The first one is the one that you, Pauliina, already mentioned. This is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is the president of the country, who got elected a couple of years ago. And this would be an example of a populist radical right leader in government. The second very clear example is in my own country, in Chile, and this is a brand new populist radical right party, which it's mainly driven by one leader. His name is José Antonio Cast, and he gets in the polls roughly 10% of the vote. But this would be an example of the populist radical right in the opposition. And I would say these are the only 2 cases within Latin America that, at least from my knowledge, I would say these are clear examples of the populist radical right. When I'm talking about the populist radical right, one brief comment on that, I'm using here the usual conceptualization that comes from the European context, mainly the notion developed by Cas Mudde, who says that populist radical right parties offer a combination of 3 ideological tenets, and these tenets are nativism, populism, and authoritarianism. And again, in the case of Latin America, I see only these 2 cases, José Antonio Cast in Chile and Jair Bolsonaro. These are the only 2 cases in which we see leaders that are combining these 3 ideological tenets. They're speaking the language of populism, they're playing with nativist ideas, and at the same time, they are very authoritarian. It is interesting to note here that in this definition that I'm using, that comes in fact from the European context, there is no relationship with the economy. It's not, populist radical right forces might develop very different types of economic programs. And in fact, Terri knows that quite well. In the European context, many of these populist radical right parties are in favor of the welfare state, although with a very peculiar notion of who should deserve welfare. And this is why we talk about the welfare chauvinism. Because, for example, in France, the Front National will say, of course, we want to have a very strong welfare state, but only for the real French people. But if you go to Latin America, for example, Bolsonaro and Jose Antonio Cast develop a very neoliberal agenda. In fact, they want to privatize most of the economic system, which is at odds a bit with the radical right in Europe. But this is, again, something important to mention that Terri mentioned briefly in her presentation also, and this is divide about the cultural dimension, the economic dimension. And the way in which I understand the populist radical right, I would say that it's driven mainly by cultural issues. And this also explains in part why the radical right in Latin America is so irrelevant. And the explanation for that is that in Europe, at least, it's very clear that the emergence and consolidation of the populist radical right, it is deeply related to the post-material revolution. This is the classical modernization argument of Ronald Inglehart, who says economic growth, sustained economic growth over decades has led to the rise of a post-material society, which means that large chunks of the populations are getting very liberal, very cosmopolitan, and then you have the backlash against those values, and this is the populist radical right. Latin America, because it's much more underdeveloped in economic terms, it hasn't reached that level of post-materialism, so to say, that you have the backlash. But nevertheless, I think there is no coincidence that in Brazil and Chile, we are seeing that type of backlash, and partly it's related because Chile and Brazil are, in relatively speaking, are very well-developed economies within the Latin American context. Of course, they're very unequal, but you still have, if you look, for example, survey data from World Value Survey data, you will see that you have also this post-materialism coming in, so to say, for a certain section of the population. But again, to reinforce the main argument that I want to develop here, I think that the populist radical right in Latin America is the exception rather than the rule. And the main argument for that is an economic argument. Because material values are still predominant in the Latin American context, there is no much space for the politicization of that cultural agenda driven by the populist radical right. And I think that the COVID pandemic will reinforce that sort of development because it's generating a huge economic crisis across all Latin America. And this is why I think material values will continue to be very relevant, at least in the couple of next years. That's my first point.
Great, thank you so much, Cristóbal. And I think this provides a really nice segue to my second set of questions, where I want to dig in a little more deeper into these geographic dynamics that you've all mentioned already and touched on some of this. And I think that this is me talking about especially the European context. Is that what seems true across the different contexts that we're talking about here today too, is that it's truly the social cultural issues that are at the heart of these parties and politicians' agenda. Yet we do also see that their success also tracks regions and localities that have distinct economic characteristics. So should we consider these geographic divides as primarily cultural or economic? And are they driven by protest or programmatic concerns? Are there underlying programmatic concerns? And how is the populist radical right or the populist right or the far right reshaping the long-standing connections between other parties and their traditional geographic bases? So I'll go back to Terri and I'll let her answer this. Thank you.
Right. And, you know, it's really interesting to really look at, I like the case of Germany because, you know, it's important to watch the growth of these parties and also the change in these parties. So the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, was not a particularly radical right party when they started out. They were anti the euro, which was a popular position to take in Germany because a lot of people didn't like the euro, especially after the fiscal crisis. So to a certain extent, you know, that's linked to the fiscal crisis and what happened there where Germans felt they were bailing out, you know, the southern part of Europe and so on. But, you know, they took a shift. So we have to come back to this issue of immigration, right? And I really do believe that immigration and race are basically intertwined in Europe as well as here in the US. And this idea of cultural threat doesn't necessarily link to geography because some of the places where the radical right is doing best don't have immigrants or, you know, people of color. So there is no direct link there, but there is this sense of cultural threat in the idea behind We need to, in Austria, Austria for the Austrians, France for the French, all of this. And so what the radical right parties and the populists are tapping into is, and I'm so glad that Cristóbal brought back this idea of, because I haven't heard people talking about post-materialism for years, but this is important because it's not that people are deprived. The people in East Germany who are voting for the AfD are, and the same thing with Trump voters, right? Where the Trump voters, the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th are not people who are deprived. So we have to really dig in to what is causing these people to be attracted to these parties, and a lot of it is this kind of interaction between post-materialism and cultural threat, in the sense that, oh my gosh, my country, the vote in my country is becoming more and more people who don't look like me. So when I'm sitting in I'm trying to think of a good city in East Germany, but it's not that I'm seeing a lot of people, around me who are immigrants or from different backgrounds. It's that when I'm watching television, when I'm watching who's, being elected to different positions, all of that, that's where they're seeing that threat. And they also know that even though they're comfortable, they're worried that, they are going to have. So I think the geography is, politicians really trying to tap into that fear of the future, that, we are going to lose our privilege, and so on. And that it's so hard to make the direct comparisons, because here in the US, there certainly are people who feel like the rise of women, even as well as people of color, into positions of power is directly threatening to them. And here in the U.S., the geography very clearly ties to this, to a certain extent. I don't want to overemphasize this, but to the South, and the history in the South, and this idea of independence. But I think we need to do more work around, because I'm really fascinated by how the CSU has tried to take over a lot of the rhetoric of the radical right, and the rhetoric in France, because what I've been seeing is since the mid 90s, when I really started focusing on this stuff, is the rhetoric is shifting, even with the mainstream parties. So it's about political competition when you get right down to it. And the other thing we have to bring back into play is, where are the working class voters? So it's the white working class voters are the ones who are feeling the most under threat, and who are attracted, to a certain extent, because we know here in the US it's not just the white working class, it's the people who feel threat because they, business owners, so SME, small, medium entities. So we have to look beyond just the working class and say it's these people who have the small businesses. It's the people who even are working and make a lot of money, working in I really focused back in the 90s on the changes in industry and manufacturing, and how men were being more negatively impacted by the changes there than women. So anyway, I think the geography has a lot to do with kind of the changes in manufacturing and the shift to service jobs and the post-materialism. And we need to do a better job of tying that into how that's playing out in terms of the electoral competition. Because the one thing we haven't mentioned is the steep decline of far left parties in the context of the rise of far right parties in Europe. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Terri. There's lots to talk about later. I'll now give the floor to Tarek again.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to have this comparative discussion, because in some ways, building off what Cristóbal said, India is far more underdeveloped even than Latin America on economic indicators. And yet we have a party that has historically been seen as supported by most of its elite constituents rise to national prominence. And so I think the puzzle is perhaps most acute of the ones that we're talking about in the Indian case. In terms of geography, the most relevant geographic divides informing the BJP success is that of region, not urban-rural. In 2014, 75% of the BJP's tally in the national elections came from just 8 states in the north and the west of the country. And it's had much less success outside this northern Indian Hindi belt, especially in the south and east of the country. There are many reasons for that, but one of the main ones is that Hindu nationalism as a movement has really emerged out of northern and Hindi belt, the Hindi belt context. And the south and eastern parts of the country have had strong linguistic and subnational regionalist movements and political parties that have historically resisted any kind of homogenizing nationalism, both that of the Indian National Congress, which was not a Hindu nationalist vision, but now even the BJP's kind of northern inspired homogenizing nationalism rooted in specifically northern cultural traditions hasn't found as much purchase. Although in recent years, there's been some erosion in the East, the South has been relatively resistant. But the second key divide, and that actually speaks to some of the questions we've got in the chat books from Joshua and Sumaira, is that even inside its regional strongholds, the second division the party had to overcome was that of caste. So again, the geography, the political geography was not a spatial one. It was a caste-based internal one, which was, even as it wanted to be a party of all Hindus, the BJP, again, historically was pigeonholed as a party of upper caste elites. And so the internal divisions within Hinduism were really the big bulwark that were checking the rise of this formation. And its initial rise to prominence actually was more closely like a cultural backlash party, where it got some support among upper castes who were fearing the rising lower caste assertion within Indian democratic politics, including expanding sets of affirmative action quotas for lower castes. And so the BJP kind of siphoned off a lot of upper caste support who were worried about this, what was called a rising silent revolution of lower caste politics. But its now recent growth has not been about that. It's how has it expanded beyond that? And there, I think this cultural backlash has more limited purchase. So it's a kind of inversion of some of the dynamics that others are talking about. The steady growth of lower caste supporting the party in recent years has really been a puzzle, because the party continues to heavily overrepresent upper caste legislators. So the vast majority of its legislators remain upper caste, and yet its support base is becoming more of a rainbow coalition of castes. In my work, I've documented how the private provision of welfare, a very material strategy by many of its movement affiliates in the Hindu nationalist movement, started this trend of rising lower caste support. And now more, I think it's been joined by this Modi effect, which has gone beyond those of an elite background, in part because Modi himself is not from an upper caste background. So he has a powerful resonance beyond this kind of elite upper caste kind of profile that the BJP has. So as we've seen this expansion on caste grounds, we've seen a continued kind of northern bias on geographic grounds. And the rural-urban divide has not been electorally significant. And in some ways, that's surprising, given that India's had strong agrarian mobilization. Many of us will be familiar with the farmer protests going on in India today. And so you might look at that and say, aha, I see signs of rural discontent. That's true. And many people were picking up on some of that discontent before the 2019 elections and saying that there were protests even in the run-up to the 2019 elections by farmers, and people were saying maybe this is evidence of a kind of reactivation of a rural-urban divide. But in fact, the BJP, which has historically again been an urban upper caste party, did even better in the countryside than it had in previous elections. So it's actually consolidating its foothold in rural constituencies. So it's really resisting easy narratives around how right-wing populism emerges. It's not simply nativist cultural backlash. It's not simply among people who are in urban areas. It's not simply even in accordance with the party's own previous success stories among upper castes. It's really been this kind of counterintuitive mobilization that's been expanding over time, including into the countryside, including among lower castes, including among lower classes, that has changed the face of what this party looks like. It can no longer be called a party of elites. In the time I started writing my book, that's what it was called. You can no longer call it that. And that has been the transformation.
Great, thank you so much. I think this is just really fascinating, thinking about how these parties are able to extend their bases and really mobilize voters that we would consider probably, that should be against voting for the issues that they stand for. So Cristóbal, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think that the clearest example in this regard is probably Bolsonaro, because he was elected president of the country, and this means that he got a majority, at least for the executive, not for the legislative. So which means we have data showing who are those who voted, more than 50% of the Brazilian population, who supported a populist radical right leader. And if we look at the research that has been done around Bolsonaro, there are some interesting features that to a certain extent challenge some of the assumptions that we have about how does the populist radical right work. So one of the issues that we normally read in the literature is exactly what Terri was saying before, that those who vote for the populist radical right are the so-called modernization losers. And these are losers not in objective sense, but rather in a subjective sense. These are not really deprived. These are not people that are dying on the streets. These are people that at a subjective level they feel threatened. But if you go to the case of Bolsonaro, we know that in fact his stronghold is Rio de Janeiro, which is a bit awkward because Rio de Janeiro is quite a cosmopolitan city. And in fact, rich people in Rio de Janeiro supported Bolsonaro, which again shows that this argument that the modernization losers are the ones that vote for the populist radical right, at least for the case of Brazil, it's not really happening. I would say it's rather the opposite. Those who are really deprived in Brazil voted for the left, for Lula da Silva. He was not able to compete in the elections, but for the person that put the Partido de Trabajadores put forward then. But in this sense, you still see like this sort of class voting in Brazil still operates in the sense that poorer people tend to vote for the left, whereas in the case of Brazil, for Bolsonaro, it's rather richer people that vote for the populist radical right and for Bolsonaro then. But again, I think the case of Brazil, it's very peculiar and we cannot generalize on that example. And the reason for that is that we have to understand that the election in Brazil when Bolsonaro came to power was a very peculiar one, because the country was shaken by a huge corruption scandal that affected not only the left-wing party, but the whole political establishment. And this is why voting for Bolsonaro, to a certain extent, was programmatic. It has to do with this issue of the cultural backlash. But at the same time, there is a lot of evidence showing that the vote for Bolsonaro was a protest vote. There were a lot of people angry with the political establishment, and they wanted to give a sign to the political establishment that they are fed up. And to give that sign was voting for Bolsonaro. But this doesn't mean that all Brazilians, all these 50% that voted for Bolsonaro are radical right-wing voters, because part of them were just fed up with the political system. And I think we have to disentangle these two different forces, because one reason for voting for that leader was that programmatically you adhere to his ideas, and another one is that you're fed up with the system. And for example, if we go to Chile, to my own country, in which a populist radical right is not a government, is in opposition, then we see that this is much more a programmatic vote. But this is a limited amount of voters who are willing to vote for that sort of political force. And it's much more like the European context. This is around 5, 10, 15% of the vote who are willing to vote for a populist radical right force in the case of Chile. And in this case, again, I think it's programmatic. But another interesting fact in the Chilean case that resembles the Brazilian one, if we look at the data about who are supporting the populist radical right in Chile, who supports Jose Antonio Camps, tend to be richer people again. It's not the really deprived, it's quite the opposite. These are really, really, really upper class that feel threatened, not mainly because of immigration, but much more because of this cultural dimension. It has a lot to do with feminism, for example, people that have strong conservative values, and they feel threatened because like this new development that is taking force all over Latin America. We have to take into account that Argentina a couple of months ago passed a law in favor of abortion, for example. And for many conservatives, this is a real shock about what is going on in the region, so to say. And in this sense, again, I think that this whole debate about this urban-rural and the modernization losers and winners, I mean, it's different in the Latin American context. And I don't think that the theories that we have developed for Europe, we can translate it and try to use them in the Latin American context, but we need to be careful because they don't work in the same way as they work, for example, for explaining what is happening in France, Germany, and Italy. And again, it has to do with another sort of economic context in the Latin American situation. And last but not least, I also, one important factor that Terri mentioned, and with that I will close my presentation, is the evangelical vote. This is something that in the case of Bolsonaro was very important. And also we know in the case of Chile, evangelicals tend to vote for the populist radical right. But again, generalization is difficult because evangelicals are very plural. It's not that all evangelicals are very conservative, but a section of them tend to be very conservative. And these evangelicals are cross-class. You have very poor evangelicals, you have middle class, and you have upper class. And what the populist radical right, in the case of Chile and Brazil, is trying to do, is to mobilize that type of voters with this sort of cultural framing that, again, is not much related with immigration, but much more with issues around feminism and other issues that are against like the sort of conservative values that are very relevant for certain sections of the evangelical church.
Thank you, Cristóbal. I think this all just speaks to how we really need to rethink and reevaluate the sort of economic connections to the radical right, and how we think about the wide working classes as drivers for the support for these parties. So I'd like to pose one more set of questions before we move to the Q&A, and because I see that we're a little short on time, let's do a quick lightning round on ways forward and what you see the future holds. And feel free to answer any combination of these questions. So I want to ask you all whether you see these geographic divides or these patterns that you've described. Do you see them as fixed or malleable, and if so, how? And will they continue to deepen in the future? And what potential and strategies exist for other parties and political actors to mobilize voters who are turning to these parties across space and place? Thank you. We'll go to Terri.
Yeah, of course, this has been a huge issue for the left in Europe. And, I think one of the factors at play is that we have to kind of look historically at how this has transformed over time. The parties have changed to a certain extent. A lot of the rhetoric has been overtaken by the mainstream right. The issues around policies have played in different ways in different countries. So it's kind of hard to come up with one, overarching idea around this. But I do think that what's going to happen, I've written an article about what's left for the left, basically, is we're seeing that as we've seen the decline in left parties, and we need to, I think one of the things we have to do is take a broader look at the party spectrum and where support is going and who and why. Some of this is personality driven, and some of it is driven by particular issues. So, the abortion issue, obviously here in the US, has been a particular factor that has played into support for GOP candidates. I think in France, the connection, and in certain other countries, the connection to Islam has been and terror. I mean, we can't forget that there have been these issues around terrorism in every one of these countries we're talking about. So you can't disconnect the political from what's happened in terms of terrorism and the cultural threat component. And for those, I know somebody was asking about the definition of cultural threat, and there's tons of research on this, so I'm not going to jump into it now, but just feel, if you want to reach out to me and ask for some research around this, I'm happy to help. But the general idea is that you have these groups that have been in political power, and they are seeing that they're being threatened by other people, new faces that are coming in, and women. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tariq.
Yeah, just very quickly, I would say that of the coalition that the BJP has put together, there are some parts that are entrenched and that are unlikely to be flipped. Those include upper castes who've been supporting the party for many, many decades, voters who are opposed to quotas and special privileges for minorities and a reduced role of the state in the economy. As I said, those programmatically oriented voters are not going to switch from the party anytime soon. And then people who hold anti-Muslim prejudices, which we haven't referred to in the party, but those are core vote banks for the party. They're not going to flip. Who might flip, who are the recent entrants into the coalition: younger voters, lower caste voters, voters with higher exposure to media, and voters especially attached to Modi. That's a more tenuous hold and reliant on this Modi factor, which, while very, very powerful now, is also very recent. And so it's hard to say that those are, very entrenched support bases for the party. The problem in opposition forces capturing those voters is that the Modi effect is underlined by structural advantages. The BJP, unlike a lot of populist parties, the BJP is India's best organized party, relies on an extensive network of grassroots affiliates under the Hindu nationalist movement, and has developed a massive financial advantage based in part by electoral reforms it passed in the name of transparency, but really which allow anonymous corporate donations, Recent available data shows that the BJP received 95% of all election financing through this method. All of India's other parties got 5%. I mean, that's an unthinkable advantage in a multi-party system. So when we're talking about can you soak up that support, I've identified the demand side, which voters might be available, but the supply side, which parties are able to actually compete in an increasingly unlevel landscape, is another kind of obstacle to actually processing that conversion.
Thank you. Cristóbal.
Yes, I mean, regarding the Latin American context and your question of whether these divides are malleable or not, I would say definitely yes. And this is based also on what we see in other countries. For example, if you think about the populist radical right in Europe, as Terri was saying, there is a lot of variance about which are the main issues. So if you look, for example, at the party programs of the Front National and parties like that in the 80s, they were not anti-Muslims, they were anti-refugees. They were mainly anti-immigrants and anti-refugees. And after 9/11, there was a switch in the discourse, and they started to say the main issue is not really immigration, but it's rather Muslim immigration. And it might be that in 5 years, they're going to be reinvented in another way. And I think the same applies for the Latin American context. As I was saying before, here in Latin America, immigration is not the main issue, in part because we don't have that high numbers of immigrants as in the US or in the case of Europe. We do have, for example, at the moment, many immigrants from Venezuela because of the crisis of the country, but this is people that have the same culture, the same language, the same religion. So there is not much cultural threat, so to say, because of Venezuelans coming to Chile or to Brazil. Okay, in Brazil it's Portuguese, but still very close to Spanish. So in this sense, that's not the main issue that the populist radical right is politicizing. As I mentioned before, what the radical right is politicizing at the moment, it has much to do with these cosmopolitan values related to issues like gender, abortion, divorce, for example, gay rights, issues like that. But it could be the case that in 5 years' times, the populist radical right can reinvent itself in Latin America and try to politicize other issues. And one of the issues that they really politicize, and this is very clear in the case of Bolsonaro and very clear in the case of José Antonio Caz, has to do with criminality. One of the main issues for the Latin American public is security, because we do have very high levels of criminality. And what populist radical right part actors do in the Latin American context is to combine this cultural threat with this issue of having very high criminality and saying what we need is very strong law and order, a law and order against criminals, but at the same time against all those who are developing these values, these cosmopolitan values. And that sort of combination, I think, is the sort of winning formula that Bolsonaro was able to exploit in the Brazilian context, and that to a certain extent, José Antonio Caz is also developing here. And last but not least, the other issue that I think it's important to consider, that we don't have almost no research into that in the Latin American context, but we have research about that in the US and in Europe, is the question about negative partisanship towards the populist radical right. And I think this is crucial because we have been talking here the whole time about who supports the populist radical right, where do they come from, it's cultural, it's economic, it's middle class, etc. But another interesting question is who are those who reject the populist radical right? I have been involved in a project in Europe, for example, in which we try to develop negative partisanship towards populist radical right parties in Western Europe. And it's huge. More than 50% of Europeans will never vote in their lives for those parties, which is a very good news in terms of democracy, because it shows that people in Western Europe don't really like those parties. And my impression is that in many Latin American countries, something similar could happen. And again, Bolsonaro, I think, is the exception. But I have just run a survey in Chile in which I included items to measure negative partisanship towards José Antonio Caz, and it's very high. Most people dislike this guy and that party. So, but we talk a lot about them, although they get like a limited amount of votes because they're very good about making noise, being in the media. But I think there is also this reaction against those forces that I think we can see in Europe, in the US, but I think it's also present in Latin America, and we need more research about that.
Thank you, Cristóbal. I think that's really interesting. I could ask a million follow-up questions to all of you, but I now want to give a chance to our audience to ask questions, and let me just get started with some of the questions here that I see in the chat. So there's a question from Berenike Schott, who's asking, what role do you think different local and regional histories play in shaping the geographies of support for the populist or the far right? And why do you think we see more persistent support for these parties across decades or even generations in some regions compared to others? Who would like to take up that question?
Okay, I guess I'll start. That's a hard question because we're still learning a lot about this, and when you think about the fact that a lot of these parties are relatively new, I think I would rather put that question in the broader context of party systems, because if you had asked me that question in the early 1990s, even late 1980s, back then we talked about the persistence of party systems. And there really hadn't been a lot of change. And, you have the left wing, you have the right wing, blah, blah. But we're seeing those shifts now. And, we're still trying to understand, I think, what are some of the factors playing into this shifting party system. And, I especially look at France. I mean, I just can't keep pace, or Italy, trying to keep pace with the party shifts, and all of this has been really difficult, as you know. So I think we're still to a certain extent in. And I kind of look at the 2008, 2009 fiscal crisis as being a real, important turning point for Europe in terms of the party systems. And I would say that the far right has tried to take advantage of certain issues like the terrorism and immigration and so on, but so have the mainstream right parties in particular. And the mainstream left, I feel, has just been off haven't been able to find the ground. So they can't, the ground is shifting too much for them. And as like I said before, what's happening with working class voters is an important component of this, is that they are going to different parties, not necessarily just the far right. So I think what we need to do is we're really going to have to recast a lot of the ways we look at these issues. And I'm in the process of doing that to a certain extent. I've been trying to learn more about what's going on with left parties in Europe in particular.
I mean, I can just quickly say that I think it's a great question, but some of it depends on what we define as the scale of geography. I mean, we know this from the US that we've often said red state and blue state, but we know that really if we go down to the urban level, and even if we go down to the urban pockets of certain cities, we have micro level geographies of voting, right? And the same is true in most contexts, including in India. So at a macro scale, I talked about how some states have regionalist movements that have articulated opposing ethnic dimensions of politics to a Hindu-Muslim divide, and those have proved to be quite an effective bulwark against efforts to polarize a Hindu-Muslim political divide. Other states have not had that, and we see that very clearly in the electoral data. The BJP wins 90% of the time when it goes up against the Indian National Congress. That's not a regional party that has an ethnicized region, and it wins more like 50% of the time when it goes against a regionalist party. So obviously there's a scale there, but then you can go with this micro level scale, and the issues of caste and class that I talked about crop up. So some of this, it's not a full answer, is that the scale of the geography that we're looking at matters a lot. And I think we have to be more attentive to those different scales when we study this, and not paint too broad a brush when we say this is where the support comes for a right-wing formation, or any formation for that matter.
Thank you. Cristóbal, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, I mean, two very short comments. First, I fully agree with Tariq that, again, I think making this broad generalization, it's quite difficult, because Germany is different than France, and it's different than Brazil, and it's different than Chile, of course. And this is why I do think that this geographical dimension is quite interesting, but probably operates differently in different regions, even at the subnational level. That being said, one commonality that I think it's interesting to note is the way in which populist radical right parties usually get successful is about building electoral stronghold. I mean, and this is true for all political parties, not only for populist radical right parties. But for example, if you look at Belgium, it's very clear that they started in Antwerpen, a port city, and this is where they started to grow up. And from there, they're able to continue to grow to other places of the country. If you think about Bolsonaro, it's Rio de Janeiro. This is the electoral stronghold. And from there, he tries to build something up. And I think this is probably one common pattern, but the interesting issue here is, again, that in some places it might be a very urban area, like, for example, in the case of Rio de Janeiro, that it's very cosmopolitan, or if you go to the case of Antwerp in Belgium, it's relatively for the country, it's okay, maybe a big city, not as big as Rio de Janeiro, but in which you have this deindustrialization process that leads to this feel of a cultural threat that probably supports that sort of party. But again, I do think that the geographical dimension is interesting, but we need to be very careful when trying to develop like these generalizations.
Thank you. And there's a question from Nasla Konya as well. And I think she's referring to what Terri was talking about in terms of the capital attacks. So would the panelists comment on various strategies used by populist parties and leaders in power to mobilize insurgent masses in the streets? And perhaps you can also talk about the sort of counter populist right movements that we see happening as well, and what kind of role those play in this equation. Thank you.
Right. I mean, one of the things people have focused in on here in the U.S. is Antifa, which is a very amorphous. It's not an organization, but really, there's been a lot of organizations around that focus on issues of race and social justice that have counter protests. We saw this especially in Charlottesville. And so there's a lot of organizations here in the U.S. and actually across Europe that are do counter protest. So it's one of the interesting things to me is, especially a couple of years ago when there was a lot of protests by far right groups, not particularly parties per se, but neo-Nazis and so on, is that there have been very effective counter protests that kind of swamp these other groups. And that one of the things is, and we should probably do a whole nother talk just about the media, the role of the media, right? Because the media has tended to focus, even if it's a small event by the far right, they tend to focus on that. And I remember there was this huge counter protest in Germany that didn't get any media coverage here, especially here in the US. And yet there was this very small kind of neo-Nazi protest that got all the press. So I think, sometimes the lack of counter protest is under publicized, but the far right populists tend to get a lot more of the publicity. So we could talk a lot about that, but I'd want to make sure I leave my co-panelists some time to respond.
Good.
Yeah, I would just say it's a good question, but I would almost put it the other way, that in fact protest has been the one space more for anti-BJP political activism, actually far more effectively than regular party politics. I would say opposition party politicians have been pretty defunct and pretty unsuccessful in their electoral strategies. Where the Modi regime has faced its most significant challenges has been popular protest. And we can see that much of the regime's efforts have been in growing illiberalism and attacks on democratic dissent. So the widespread use of preventative detention against activists, charging of peaceful protesters who were first protesting the Citizenship Amendment Act that for the first time introduced explicitly religious criteria in the eligibility for certain categories of citizens, the use of colonial era sedition laws, and attacks on critical journalists, newspapers, and students who express disagreement. This actually harkens back, many analysts, this is not my point, many analysts have said that in handling of protest and dissent, we are now beginning to approximate, not fully there yet, but beginning to approximate the months leading up to India's one period of democratic suspension, which was its emergency from 1975 to 1977 under Indira Gandhi, when formal democracy was suspended. And many of these moves were happening in the build up to that as well. We're not to where we were at the emergency yet, but we have had many of those democratic backsliding, in particular in the handling of protests against the Modi regime's policies and actions. So I would say that is protest has actually been the one area of dissent, but also revealed some of the most heavy-handed and draconian strategies of the regime.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, short on that, I think what is interesting about the question is to reflect that in a comparative perspective. I mean, the whole issue about the capital attacks, I think what we tend to forget from a comparative perspective is the peculiarity of Trump and the Republican Party. What happened in the US is unimaginable that would happen in a mainstream right party in Western Europe. Imagine Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel will never call via Twitter that some people should go to the Bundestag and react against like that she lost the election. And the US started to be normal, and started to be normal because the Republican Party is anything but a mainstream right party. I think the Republican Party, and that started before Trump, and I think because of Trump, it started to get reinforced, so to say, or reforced this whole approach. But the Republican Party, I think it's a populist radical right party nowadays. And we see the whole debate, what happens afterward now with the impeachment. At the end of the day, some Republican leaders voted against Trump, but still the majority is with him. And this shows that the main danger for me is not necessarily populist radical right parties. And we see that in Europe, because populist radical parties normally tend to receive a limited amount of votes. The main problem is when mainstream right parties start to adapt to that sort of ideas and even transform into populist radical right party. And this is probably what is happening in the US with the Republican Party. In this sense, I think what is crucial to understand is how mainstream parties react to the rise and consolidation of populist radical right parties. Brazil, the same story. I think a huge mistake is that there was this huge corruption scandal that affected the whole political establishment. And because of that, as I mentioned before, many people voted for Bolsonaro because they were fed up with the system. And even many politicians within Brazil, they were quite silent about Bolsonaro and they were not reacting very harshly against him. And because of that, then you can see figures like Trump or like Bolsonaro coming into power. But again, we have to understand that this is not only related to themselves, but also to how mainstream parties react and transform themselves over time.
I think that's a really key issue, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I wish we had more time, but I think unfortunately there are many questions that are wonderful left in the queue, but we need to close up right now. So thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists for joining us and everyone in the audience. And let's keep this conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions.